So next up for the last talk before lunch is myself and Chris Canham. So we'll be talking a little bit about the SoundSoftware project that we've been working on. I did introduce this at the beginning, but one of the reasons that we're talking about this now and our progress is that we're coming towards the end of the project at the end of September, so this will be the end of the funded part of the project. And so one of the things that we are tackling in the last few months of how do we set this up to continue the activities, or at least leave a legacy for the project that will be able to continue these things. For those of you not familiar with this phrase, are we nearly there yet? We've been on a long journey, and you may be familiar with children in the back of the car that will say, are we nearly there yet? Are we nearly there yet? And I think we'll find that we've still got a little way to go just yet. So what I'll be talking about today, or will be talking about, is really the background behind the project, why we're doing the project in the first place, and some of the things that we've been doing, like education and training, facilities and tools, software, and engagement, including events like this, and some things that we've still got to do, and finish off with some conclusions before we take break for lunch. So, in terms of background, so you've seen this slide already. For those of you that were here at the beginning, we're funded by EPSRC. This is the UK Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and one of the things that they realise is that software is actually an investment in building infrastructure that helps research to happen. So just as European collaborators have put a lot of money into the Large Hadron Collider, there's also software that's being built to allow research to happen. Now, in many of the people working in the community here, we sometimes don't notice this, but then you realise that you're using things like MATLAB, web audio tools, or you're building things yourself. And so if you think about that way, the code that you build to do your experiments, this is like a physicist building their own equipment before carrying out their own experiments. And maybe you may not necessarily trust the physicists to build themselves a Large Hadron Collider before they do their experiments. You might end up with some results that might suggest that things can move faster than the speed of light or something if you don't quite get your experiments right. And you might remember that from I think it was before Christmas last year. But here we want to help developers, particularly in this community, to build high-quality research tools. If you look at the software.ac.uk project without sound on it, a lot of work they've been doing is to help large projects of researcher engineers develop software that researchers will use. Here, we've been concentrating on helping researchers develop their own software and look at the sort of issues of training and so on that come in here. So we looked at some of the software practices as one of the first things that we did in this project back in 2010. Some of you may remember us talking about this survey before, but we asked, I think, around 50 plus researchers altogether about code development. And out of the researchers that we asked, about 80% said that they developed software. The other sort of 20%, 18% are probably people that now manage research projects and don't actually develop that. Out of that 80%, about 1/3 said that they took steps to make their code reproducible. So we've already lost 2/3 of people that are not really even thinking about it yet. And of that 1/3, about 1/3 said that they actually made their code available and 2/3 didn't. So out of all the people involved in here, about 10% or 15% of people that are actually building code were really releasing that. One of the other sort of slightly scary things is that about half the people said that the code never even left their computer. So your computer dies, well, that's it. So this was clearly something that showed to us that we needed to do some work on some of these sorts of issues. We looked at some of the things in the survey about why people weren't trying to reproduce the code. There were some general issues that we came across, things like researchers are not trained software engineers, and so you don't have the practices that you might expect a computer science graduate to be doing once they've got into industry. You pick up bad practices from nearby, but also there are other things about software as being something personal to you that you're developing for the graph in your paper, and that's the job, and then you throw the software away once you've done that. The idea that software is something that actually should be part of the evidence that supports the paper and that you should expect to reproduce that was not really out. And also, once you get used to that, you get a sense that if I publish my code, somebody might find a bug in it, and therefore I might have to retract my research. Whereas if I don't publish it, nobody can tell whether it's wrong or not. Now, clearly this is bad for... Nobody said this, but you sort of get that sense. But this is bad for science if you don't get this stuff out. But you can see where these things are coming into the community. There are also people that talked about that they might want to commercialise their code afterwards, and so therefore they didn't want to publish it in case they could turn a business out of it. And even though this was 12 years ago that they first had the idea for that, and they still hadn't produced their business yet, they might still do that. So there are these sorts of tensions coming out from here. And so we identified roughly that these were things about education and confidence with the code. If you're not confident that the code works, then that might act as a barrier to publishing it. If you haven't got the tools to do that, many research groups don't have version control as standard within an audio research group. So that's the sort of tool that we're looking at. And also incentives for publication. Within the field as it is at the moment, you don't need to publish your code because reviewers will say, oh, looks like that's all right, the graph looks fine, yeah, I'm sure that's fine, yes, publish. Whereas actually what we want to get to a point is where people are encouraged to do that. So we've been looking at some other methods like prizes and so on to encourage that ahead of the change in the culture. So these are some of the things that we've been doing. I'll talk about these a little bit more. Education and training, the software carpentry you'll mention about, facilities and tools like code hosting and reproducible research, and some specific collaborative projects, so some practical help of actually taking some projects and helping to develop these up to make them reproducible, and a bit more in terms of engagement and prizes we'll talk about in a minute. So the first thing on the education and training side, when we started the project, when we were putting the project together, we come across Greg Wilson, who's been running the software carpentry project, encouraging researchers to learn about software development. So this is not a full becoming a software engineer course. It's not the sort of thing that you need to take 12 weeks working on, but a small number of lectures that will just give you the basics of structured software development, version control, databases, even starting with the shell, because there are many things that you can do with a shell that means you don't actually have to do any software development in the first place, and it's got a nice history that remembers what you did. So we started off with, at the beginning of the project, with a 5-day autumn school, about 20 people for that. We found that was a bit too much. People were running out of steam by the end of that. The room was a bit small as well, for anyone that remembers it, if you were there. And so we had a new version just over a year later, where we turned it into a 2-day workshop as part of a revision of the software carpentry thing with Greg, and ran that model a couple more times in a pre-conference boot camp we had before DAFX 2012, which is actually where this picture comes from in York, and that's Greg up in front talking about that. But the sustainable model for this is that once you've been on one of these, actually it doesn't take very much before you can learn how to be one of the tutors on this. You could break the course down into different sections. We run other tutorials at conferences as well, but we've also run versions of these for PhD students coming through our PhD program. So where we want to go with this is to embed this into PhD programs, and that's something that we want to now integrate with that. Chris, is there anything you want to say at this point about these, or are you happy for me to carry on?
Fine.
Okay. Okay.
Carry on.
So now the software carpentry boot camps, if you Google software carpentry, this work in 2012 was really at the beginning of now what's turning into a really sustainable model for this. So if you're interested in picking up these, then where there's a tailored version that we have with some audio stuff at the end, but essentially you could take this, build it into anything that you wanted to as part of your research group's training program. Particularly in the UK with what are called doctoral training centres, for those of you that are aware of those, the idea of training PhD students as a cohort so that as well as learning how to write a paper or go to the library, you can spend a couple of days learning how to do software development. So we've also published some resources about helping you to work out how to publish research code and data, the sorts of things that you need to work on. Also, the SoundSoftware code site, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And things like choosing a license. If you don't choose a license, then by default you're retaining all the copyright. So although people can look at it, they can't actually do anything with it. So you have to have a license attached to that. And sometimes, if you're new to this, what do you do with this license? How do you actually attach it to your software so that it works? And these are sort of some of the practical things that do that. We've also talked about unit testing. I think this is something that's more difficult to work, although Guillaume mentioned that as part of the Timeside project. But this is something that I think is one of those remaining things to get into research software development. And one of the things we'll be doing towards the end of the project is to put more sort of packs of information together about what people can do from here. We've done some tutorials at conferences, so yes, we can get some people to come to boot camps for us, but the other side is to actually go out to where the researchers are. So we've gone on to the DAFEX conference, and as well as the pre-conference boot camp, we had a tutorial there, had a tutorial at the Music Information Retrieval Conference, Izmir, and also at the Audio Engineering Society 53rd conference. I haven't got the fonts installed, that's why it's slightly bigger. Yes, okay. Facilities and tools. So, Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about the code.soundsoftware project and what's been going on here?
A little unprepared. Well, the SoundSoftware code site, which many of you will have probably seen already, is a site that we host for hosting software projects that are under development by researchers in the audio and music field. And the idea here, obviously, we encourage people generally to publish their source code, and for a lot of people that will mean taking it and putting it on something like GitHub, developing it in the open and that sort of way, which is great, and we encourage people to do that, and we've always been trying to promote that kind of work. But a lot of people we've found are not necessarily so comfortable with that, either because they're not sure that they're going to want to publish their code at all, and they want to take things a little bit gradually, or possibly they're working with other institutions who are on a bigger project where certain parts are going to be public and maybe some other things are not. And then for some people, I think the idea of stepping into the world of doing everything in the open source software development world is perhaps a slightly different world from what you're used to getting started in academia, and it doesn't entirely feel like a comfortable step necessarily. And so the idea here was to provide a code site that was targeted to a particular research field, and so that you knew that other people using it were essentially your peers in academia, and also which allows you to set up projects that are collaborative between different people at different institutions, but that are private and that you can make public later if you wish. So for certain kinds of software projects, certain kinds of development, it's perhaps a more comfortable place to be. And we've got a majority of users probably who, maybe not a majority actually, quite a lot of the users have been so far people from Queen Mary. But we have quite a number of users at different institutions as well, and it is open to registration from people in this field. Anyway, it's generally with a UK focus, but anything that is relevant to UK audio and music And there are around 700 and something projects on there at the moment. If you go and look at the site, you won't see as many as that because I think around half of those are private projects, but with a ratio of around 2 on average users per project. So it's generally, we found it very useful for our own work. Go and take a look if you don't already use it.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. So that the code behind the code.soundsoftware project is actually something that is available or will be available.
Yes, the software that drives the site itself is maintained in a project on the site itself, so you can.
So it is open, right? So one of the other projects that we've been working on, and Carl Bussey is helping with the next stage of this, is a reproducible research repository. This is at rrr.soundsoftware.ac.uk. Thank you, Chris. So here we have the idea behind this is to gather together pointers to software, data, and papers that are reproducible. So we're really at the beginnings of the stage of this. At the moment, we've got some examples on there, but this is something that we will be populating over the summer and adding more projects onto that as a place that you can go to find reproducible experiments. And if you've got a particular data set, you should then be able to find out the other papers and experiments that use that data set or use that particular piece of software. In terms of software, there have been some specific development projects. I won't spend too much time going into some of these, but these were examples where we were working with other projects to help them to make the software more reproducible. So an example was from a European project, a toolbox from that called Smallbox, which included some audio but also some non-audio work, and that's had about 10,000 downloads now. And other work with ISVR, City University, and with NYU and other collaborators on making those projects available. And some plugin projects. So the VAMP plugins work within the Sonic Visualizer tool set, and so that's becoming a sort of community plugin set up here. And so some examples that we've helped people to take their MATLAB code and turn it into usable research software from there. In terms of engagement, we've had some of the reproducible research prizes, and these are things that we want to encourage conference organisers to put along with conferences. So as well as having a best paper prize, you would have a reproducible research prize to encourage people to make their research software available. We had an open one to start with, the AES 53 conference, and we're currently working with the machine learning and signal processing organisers for their next conference. Another research challenge, we worked with people on the audio scene classification project, so it helped that I was also organising this one, but the idea of making it to encourage people to release their source code afterwards was something that we hadn't thought of until we worked within this project. So sometimes even within the same group or the same person, you might not think about doing these things right. So we now have the software for these. For about 6 of the submitted systems, people agreed after the conference to make their code available. So now if you want to do acoustic scene classification, you can now have a go and download those from this Scenes Events Challenge website. Some other activities that we've been doing in terms of presenting papers at conferences, just to get the word around, journal contributions, so Greg Wilson and colleagues submitted a paper on best practices for scientific computing, which ended up in PLOS Biology. Actually, it's quite hard to find the right place to publish reproducible research code example, which is why it's ended up in PLOS Biology, but really it's relevant to any computational science. And we also made a contribution to the recent HEFKey metrics measure. So for the next assessment of research inputs, the concentration has been on citations of papers. What about code and data? If you don't have something to encourage people to make code and data available and you don't measure that, then how will you get that available? So, are we nearly there yet? Well, I think the answer will be sort of not really. There are some things that we specifically didn't do that we set up to start with, but actually those were things that we regarded as low priority after we got started. And some of the things that, like web access to digital resources, I think are now coming through some of the AHRC projects like the Big Data Digital Music Lab project that Tillman was talking about earlier on. Some things that we're still working on the summer about the Reproducible Research repository and creating information packs so that we don't lose the knowledge that has been built up within the project, to try and document some of that, and completing the Reproducible Research prizes for the Machine Learning and Signal Processing Conference. But there's still many remaining challenges in this, in the general area of just changing the expectation of researchers more widely, to get people to believe that it's important that you should be publishing the software and data as an integral part of the research. By knowing, as Bob was saying, that know that your software will be published as part of reproducible outcome when you start doing the research, so that when you write the software, then that you'll know that you're writing it in a way that other people will be able to reuse it. And we want to embed software development training into PhD training programs and other researcher training programs, so it becomes something that people can do. One thing that we found that's a little bit harder to do at the moment is code review. This is quite common in industry, to have code review from peers before it can go into the code repository. That's not really happening, we don't think, in many university groups at the moment. And so that's something that we haven't really been able to tackle. But the key thing here is to really get the thing that for researchers in publicly funded research, software and data is the evidence that supports the research, and so we need to really make it clear that that's the supporting stuff that should be available to other researchers. So many thanks to lots of people here. That I've got a few names up here, but there are lots of research collaborators and advisory board members that have helped the project to work. And so just to conclude the project, this reproducible research ideal is where we're still working towards, I think, but it still proves to be hard in order to do that, starting from a position where the expectation is not that that should happen. The idea for the project is that we've identified a few simple things and tackled those with ideas to overcome them. But major challenges still remain for the community in here, I think, about changing the views of researchers, and this thing about software as supporting evidence, that software is the thing that is like the mathematical proof, rather than some intellectual property that the university owns and it should keep secret. So I think this, once we get this change out, I think this will still be a lot of work to do. Okay, thanks very much for listening. Thank you. So maybe I'll take one quick question, and then any others we can ask over lunch. So, Sasha.
There is one. There is one possibly big blocker which wasn't mentioned there, is the argument of cost. In a way, you're asking people to do more work. So did you observe that kind of resistance when trying to evangelize people to doing, code that other people can read and so on? And if yes, did you find a clear argument? I mean, we understand all the value behind that, but still you're asking people to do more work. So
yes. So I think one of the question is really about the cost. You're asking people to do extra research in that. If it's publicly funded research that you're asking for the funding for, you can build in that cost into the funding proposal as part of what's called a pathways to impact. So you can say, for example, we're going to employ a software developer for N months in order to take this software and make it available. So actually we're just waiting for a response from a project that we put in with a significant amount of software developer time in there, and that was not a problem for the referees at all. I hope that
that's
sort of
probably
helps.
crucial point, because most of the software, like research software projects, which I've seen working best, were organized by pairing a researcher with a software engineer. But not every lab was lucky enough to have funding for the software engineer, or maybe the lab didn't think about asking for the funding of software engineers. So that's probably a crucial point, to build the funding for the software engineering into the project and actually think about it while designing the research project.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's interesting that I mean, we talked about as you're doing the research, think that you're publishing the code as you're doing it. But even before that, yes, we need to be able to get the applicants to think that they're going to do that even before they're applying, so that they can build it into the grant code. Okay, so I think we'll break for lunch there. Thanks very much for the first half. For people who are speaking in the second half, the VGA cable connection seems to have a problem, but we can use this code here. So if you've got the computer here, so if you've got your slides on a memory stick, then we can